I wanted to touch on one more thing. It's related to the theme of Chassidic way of life. And then I want to try to take some time to talk about Gimmel Tamuz. One of the things which you had on the list that I gave out was Chassidic Garb, the clothing of a Chassid. The Chassidim wear things that are a little bit different. They wear things which long. What's behind it, and why do they do that? There are different. Again, when you talk about Chassidic garb, every Chassidic group is different. There's some Chassidim, you see them wearing white socks. Some wear black socks. Some wear these fur hats. Some wear the payas. There's different. Everybody's different. I just want to talk about the general idea and where does it come from. And we'll start with one of the things, which is about wearing something, a garment which is long on Shabbos. In Chabad, during the week, most people that you bump into are dressed the way most everybody else is dressed. But Shabbos, everybody wears, we call it a kapata. It's a longer garb. Where does that custom come from, and what does it mean? Other Chassidim, they wear the longer one all week long. But what's the source for that? So first of all, I just want to say that clothing, according to Torah, is something very important. And some of you have maybe come across this in the Parsha, when it says that the Jewish people went out of Egypt. It said that they went out, and there points out three things that they didn't change. One was they didn't change their names, they didn't change their language, and they didn't change their clothing. Which means, being that they were descendants of Abraham and Yitzchak and Yaakov, there was no concept then of a Jewish nation. That started after the Torah was given. But they were descendants of Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. And they were a family. They wore certain clothing which identified that they're descendants of Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. There's also the language that they spoke, which was Hebrew. And there was also the names that they had, which were Jewish names: Reuven, Shimon, Levi, Yehuda, and so on. And in that merit, they went out of Egypt. The way this is explained is that the Jews were in Egypt. Egypt was not a country that people lived in the spirit of the Torah. On the contrary, Egypt in that time was considered the most immoral and the lowest country from a spiritual perspective. They were the lowest in the whole world. And the Jews managed to maintain their identity there because of these three things. They didn't change their garments, they didn't change their language, they didn't change their names. The general principle is as follows: one of the strongest things that lead to assimilation is the desire to be like everybody else. It's called to go with the flow. If that's where everybody's going, I want to go in that direction. I don't want to be different. So initially it might start with something very external. I don't want to be different, and I want to wear the same clothes like everybody else. And if people out there are wearing clothes that is not modest, not tznius, well, I don't want to be different, so I'll also wear those kind of clothing. If people speak a certain language, and sometimes the language is not such a refined language, but that's the way people speak, I don't want to stand out like a sore thumb. I'll speak the same kind of language. And of course, the names, I can either call myself Yaakov, I call myself Jack. I can call myself Joseph, Yosef, or call myself Joe. So I'd rather use a name that everybody else is using, which is not a Jewish name, but I use the secular name because I just fit in things better. On the surface, it doesn't look too much harm. It's only something external. But once a person gets into this mode, into this zone, that I want to go with the flow and I want to be like everybody else, it's not going to stop with external things. It's going to continue with the way you see things, the way you value things, the way you live. And that's what led to assimilation. So we know that today there are more Jews that are not associated with Judaism than there are that are associated. There's probably, I don't know, maybe 10, 12 million Jews that are Jewish, but they're not associated with Judaism. They're assimilated Jews. And generally speaking, it didn't start that way. Their parents or grandparents or great-grandparents went to shul, kept kosher, kept Shabbos, and it wasn't something happened overnight. It was usually a gradual process. And the gradual process started, the whole movement, so to speak, started in Germany. I'm talking about not recent, but like 250 years ago, maybe. And they had a slogan in Germany. I don't know if you ever heard this. The slogan was, be a Jew at home, but be a man outside, which in that context meant be a regular guy outside. In the street, be like everybody else. At home, you can be Jewish. Sounds like it's just a slogan, but the meaning of the slogan is out there, don't try to be different. Be like everybody else. That'll prevent anti-Semitism. That'll make you more acceptable. That'll make you more comfortable. But eventually, this led to the biggest assimilation ever in the history of Jewish history. And that's because we want to go with the flow. So therefore, in general, clothing is important, that we try to do something that even externally we identify with our Judaism, that I feel proud about it now that I'm hiding it and I want to be like everybody else. And again, it has a lot to do with our value system. If you value what it means to be Jewish, then you won't feel uncomfortable, you won't feel embarrassed. Every time I talk about the subject, this is the example that comes to my mind. So if you heard the ones before, please forgive me. But I think it's a perfect example. Did any of you ever see any of the astronauts going to outer space? Probably you did. They're dressed a little bit different than your average person on the street. They have these big round things around their head. They have big suits, bulky. They can hardly walk straight. They're wobbling from side to side. And they look very different. Are they embarrassed of the way they look? Are their families embarrassed of them? And don't forget that it's on television, it's online, the whole world is watching. So the embarrassment must be like beyond anything you can imagine. But they're not embarrassed, they're actually proud. Why are they proud? They look so different than everybody else because they realize we look different, but we're doing this historic mission, which is actually a mission that's going to contribute to the growth and the development of the whole world. And they're very proud to be that person. So the fact that you look different is not what the problem is. The problem is, do I value when I look different? So therefore, in Judaism, there is an emphasis on the clothing we eat and other external factors. Now, the thing with the Chassidic Garb, part of it is that we try to wear certain clothing which identify us as a Jewish person. And part of it is, especially the wearing long, has to do with the fact that years ago, clothing wasn't the way it was today. People didn't buy new clothing and didn't have a wardrobe of 20 different things. In fact, there was, I don't know if you're aware of it, but there's a bracha we make every morning. We thank Hashem for the clothing. Years ago, when you bought a new dress, you bought a new coat, a man bought a new jacket, he would make a bracha. Baruch atah Hashem, Elokeinu melech haolam, malbish harumim, or even a shechianu. Why do you make a bracha when you wear something new? Because in those days, people wouldn't wear new things. If there was something and it got torn, they would sew it up. They put on a patch. And they didn't buy new clothes every other day, the way we do today. So this was something which apparently this must have been the norm in those days, that they had the same jacket that they wore during the week. They also wore it on Shabbos. But on Shabbos, they would roll it up. During the week they would roll it up because they're working in the field. And if it's long, it interferes with the work. So they rolled it up, made it shorter, so they can go work in the field. Shabbos, when you don't work in the field, they would roll it down. So the rolling it up or rolling it down was symbolic of, is it a working day or not a working day? And that's one of the reasons why on Shabbos people wear garments that are longer. The jacket is a long jacket. representing that today is the day that Shabbos is the day of rest. We don't go to work, and therefore we wear this long garment. And what do people do all week long? You might say, oh, they don't work the whole week. That's a different story. No, that's not the reason. The reason is because even though we go to work and we're in the working world or in the business world and like everybody else, we want to make some sort of an indication that although we're there physically, but we're not really invested in that world. In other words, money and business and all that, that's not what my essence of my life. The essence of my life is I have a purpose. God created me for a purpose. And the purpose is to learn Torah, to do mitzvahs, to become a more refined person, to bring more light into the world, to transform the world. That's my purpose. Everything else is there secondary to help me and enhance the ability to do what I need to do. And therefore, we want to do some sort of an indication that even though I'm out there and doing all the mundane things that have nothing to do with Judaism, but nevertheless, I'm not invested in it with my head and my heart. I'm just doing it externally. So therefore, Chassidic Jews would wear the long garments to show that although we're out there in the world like everybody else, but we're not invested in that world. And I know that there are certain things in life which are primary and other things in life that are secondary. And my primary concern in my life is my spirituality, my relationship with Hashem, and everything else is there to be sort of an assistance to that, to help me fulfill the purpose which I'm here. Yeah.
But wasn't the style of the Kapotin hat at one point modern and like secular?
Not that I know of. It could be that in the secular world, people wore something long, which also was an indication that they're maybe ahead of something, they're in charge of something, some sort of symbol also that they're not like everybody else.
It's like in the early middle of the 20th century, like wearing suits on a daily basis was just the norm. And I thought like that's sort of like where the Kapotin hat style came from when suits was a normal thing, and we just never stopped doing it.
You're saying long was the normal thing years ago?
And stuff, yeah.
I don't know that part of the history. And have to write another 30 pages. Wait till I finish with this. Give me a break. Okay. What I'd like to do today, and we'll have some time next week a little bit. So we know that this weekend is a big weekend in Chabad here around the world with Gimmel Tamuz. Gimmel Tamuz is the day of the passing of the Rebbe, which happened in 1994. And people have a lot of questions the way this day is being commemorated in Chabad. And there are a lot of different things. This one does it one way, this one does another way, and there are a lot of questions about the subject. A lot of things that people say, and you hear things people saying that you don't understand. So first of all, if anyone has any question, before I even begin, you can bring it up, because probably whatever question you have, others have the same question. And if not, I'll start with the questions. Okay, that makes it easier. Okay. Some people that believe that he didn't die, what does that mean? Right, what are we talking about? That's the big question. What does that mean? What do those words mean? A psychologist would say it means you're in denial, something wrong, you just can't accept the facts. But no, it's something else. I really should have made the copies, but I'll tell you what this is based on. The basis for that is there's a pasuk in Chumash. It's in the last portion of the book of Bereshis. Talks about Yaakov before he passed away, he gathered his children together, he gave them all blessings, and then towards the end, he says to his children, he says sort of goodbye to them, and then it says, and he lifted his feet on the bed, and he was gathered to his people. Those are the words that are used. So Rashi says, which comes from the Gemara, from the Talmud, that how come it doesn't say that he died? And the answer is, this is what the Gemara says, Yaakov Avinu lo mes. Yaakov, our father, did not die. That's what it says in Gemara. What does that mean? So generally speaking, the way people would understand this means that in a spiritual sense, his spirit lives on, his teachings live on, he inspired his children, that inspiration continues, and that's what it means that he didn't die. But if you look in the Gemara, and you look at the commentary in Gemara, you'll see that some of them actually explain it this way, and there are others that explain it that no, that means he didn't die, means in a literal sense, whatever that means. So the next thing in the Gemara asks the question, how could you say that he didn't die when it says that they buried him? And it says that they eulogized him. And it says that they embalmed him. And that's only done for people that died. And the Gemara answers, well, I'm basing what I said on a verse in the Torah. And he brings a verse in the Torah that implies that Yaakov Avinu never died. And by the way, we find something similar with Moshe Rabbeinu. There's another source in Gemara where the Gemara says that Moshe Rabbeinu never died. And where do we know this from? Also from a pasuk in the Chumash, a verse in the Torah, where it actually talks about Moshe's death. And it says, Vayomas Sham Moshe. And Moshe died Sham, over there. And the Gemara says, this is the oral Torah explains, that the same word Sham is found in another place. And that's when Moshe went up to the mountain for 40 days and 40 nights to receive the Torah. And it says he was there, Sham, for those 40 days and 40 nights. And the Gemara says that we have one of the methods of interpreting the Torah in the oral Torah is that when you have a certain word that's written in two places, one comes to teach us that we should draw a parallel with one with the other. And the parallel is just like in the case of the 40 days and 40 nights. Moshe wasn't here. He went up on the mountain. He went up to heaven to get the Torah. But he didn't really die. He was alive. And up there, he received the Torah. And he did whatever services he needed to do for us. Then he came back. The same is when it says that Moshe passed away and he died Sham there. Also, it doesn't mean that he actually died. It means that he continues to live, just like during the 40 days he was alive. Of course, the question is, what does it mean he's alive if he was buried? Moshe was also buried, by the way, and Yaakov was buried. So what does it mean that they're alive? So I'm not saying this is a simple subject to understand, but I first want to just say that the language is something which comes from the Torah. I know it's something, sounds like really wild and radical, but it's not a homemade language that someone who is just very excited about. The Rebbe made this language up. This is a language which is found in Gemara about various tzaddikim, that in a sense, every soul, every person that passed away has a soul, and the soul continues to live. Even by people that are not righteous people. In reference to all righteous people, the Gemara says that even after the passing, they're considered alive. And then Yaakov, Moshe, and some others are an exception even amongst the righteous. But I just want to explain what those words could possibly mean. So first of all, there's a big difference between the definition of life and death according to Torah and life and death according to science. According to science, how do you define life and death? If the person is active, he's alive. If God forbid there's no activity, he's dead. If a person is not active, but internally there's brain activity, there's heart activity, they're also considered alive. But if there's no activity whatsoever, not out there, not inside, not in the brain, not in the heart, there's no breathing, nothing, by definition, they're not alive. How's the Torah different? According to the Torah, believes that we have a soul. And we say this every morning when we wake up in the morning. God Thank you for the soul that you blew into me that gives me life. So we believe, according to Torah, that we are made up of two components, a body and a soul. And the soul gives life to the body. So the definition of life is not activity. Activity is a symptom, an indication that the soul is in the body. Because God forbid, when the soul leaves the body, there's no activity. When the soul is in the body, the person is active. But the very definition of life is whether the soul is in the body or disconnected from the body. What happens when a person passes away, the soul disconnects from the body. And therefore, even a person that's not a tzaddik, the soul continues to live and the soul continues to have a life in a spiritual way, in a spiritual realm. It's the body that deteriorates, but the soul continues to live. So if that's the case, if every person is like that, then what's so unique about a righteous person? Why do we say righteous people are alive? Every person spiritually continues to live. And the answer is that by a tzaddik, even after their passing, there's still more of a connection between their soul and their body. Now, I just want to tell you again a story from Gemara. And again, no matter how difficult something sounds, but the way we define reality and the way we define what we believe in is what it says in Torah. And true, even according to Torah, according to science, according to medicine, if God forbid you see all the symptoms, halachically this person has to be declared that he's not alive. But the Torah points out that there are certain exceptions. So here's a story in Gemara. There was someone called Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. He was the one who compiled the Mishnah. And if anybody's really interested in doing the research, I have all, right in his packet, I have the sheets and the sources, because we did it in the other class. Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi was the greatest sage in his generation. He was the leader of Jewry. And in fact, in some ways, he was one of the greatest sages of all generations. He's the one that wrote the Mishnah. He began documenting the oral Torah for the first time in history. He was the descendant of King David. He was a very big tzaddik. So the Gemara says that before he passed away, he said, I need to speak to my children. And they brought in his children. And he told them two things. One of them was that after his passing, they should make sure that the lamp in his room should stay in the same place. And the table should remain in the same place. And the bed should remain in the same place. That's the story. So the Gemara asks, why was that so important? Especially the last words, the last moments of his life, you would imagine like the most important things have to be said at that time. Why was this so urgent that he had to say this to them, right? And why was it necessary? And the Gemara says that every Friday night, he came back to his family by the Friday night table. He sat down by the table and he led the Shabbos table. He actually made Kiddush for the family. And this went on for many years. Nobody was aware of this. Then an incident happened where it became public knowledge. Once it became public knowledge, he stopped. So was he alive or was he not alive? Again, he passed away. He was buried. So clearly, what the Gemara is saying here that there's certain tzaddikim that even after they pass away, they are still somewhat connected to their body and to this physical world. And if they desire to do so, they can appear and be where they want to be. And it's not the same like it is with the ordinary person. Anyone here in this room visited Hebron in Israel? 2 people? Okay. 3. 4. In Hebron, there's a shul, they call it Avraham Avinu Shul. What is so special about the shul? Why does it have that name? So the history is, and by the way, this is not a history which is a story and you don't know if it's a fairy tale or if it's real. It's a story that's documented by Torah sages that testify that this is a true story. That there was once a situation, Erev Yom Kippur, where there was such a small community there, they didn't even have 10 people for a minyan. And it's going to be Yom Kippur. Couldn't imagine Yom Kippur without being able to daven together as a minyan. So fortunately, right before the holiday began, there was a traveler that came by their little village, the city of Hebron, and he decided that he's going to stay there for the holiday. So now they had a minyan, they had 10 people. And someone made up with this man that after the fast is over, he'll come to my house and you'll break the fast in my house. The custom is that after Yom Kippur ends, you go outside to make the blessing on the new moon. It's the 10th day of the month. They went outside, they made the blessing on the new moon. It's dark outside, and everybody comes back in. And this 10th person, the guest, was gone. Nowhere to be found. I guess the first thought was that maybe he fainted and he's on the ground somewhere. And they searched and could not find him. They spent hours searching for him, and then they had to go home because they're fasting for 24 hours already. They went home, and the man that was supposed to take him to his house had a dream. And he sees this person in his dream. And he said, don't be aggravated. Don't worry about me. I'm fine. And he said, I want you to know that I am Avraham Avinu. And Avraham Avinu is the one who was buried in the city of Hebron. And I saw how aggravated you were that you don't have a minyan. So therefore I came to be the 10th person to the minyan. So I'm fine, I'm okay. But the question is, if he's not alive, then halachically he can be used for a minyan. So even though he came to make them feel good, but halachically they did something which was not halachically valid. You need 10 men to be a minyan. You can't reach from the Torah without men. You can't say the Kaddish without 10 men. You can't do other things without 10 men. And he only had 9 because the 10th wasn't a live person. So the commentaries who relate to the story say, but being that Avraham Avinu was an exceptional tzaddik, he's one of those tzaddikim that even if after his passing he's considered alive, and therefore when he came there, he had the same halachic status as a person who's alive, and they were able to have that minyan. So you have it about Yaakov, you have it about Abraham, you have it about Moshe, and our Rebbe, when the previous Rebbe passed away, very often he would speak about the same concept, that the previous Rebbe was not an ordinary tzaddik, he was an extraordinary tzaddik, and he was a leader of a generation. And maybe this will help a little bit. I'll put it on the board. The Hebrew word for a leader of the generation is nasi. That an ice cream cone? Hey, good job. Can't tell if it's vanilla or chocolate. That's good. Nasi is spelled nun, shin, yud, aleph. That means a leader. So it says in the books of Kabbalah that this is an acronym for four words. Nitzutz, Shel, Yaakov, Avinu, which means a spark, spark of Yaakov, our father. It means every leader in the generation, his soul is a spark, an extension of Yaakov's soul. And therefore he would have the same quality as Yaakov. And therefore we find it with Moshe, we find it with Abraham, another person we find it with. In fact, everybody, even people that are not necessarily familiar with Torah, sing a song with the words, David, Melech, Yisrael, Chai, V'Kaya. You know what those words mean? David, the king of Israel, lives on forever. So I think most people think, it doesn't mean him, it means his kingdom. No, it means David continues to live. So the Rebbe would say that it applies to the previous Rebbe because of that reason. That means he's still alive and he's still inspiring us. He's still looking out to give us brachas and blessings, and we can still request blessings from him. And being that this is the way the Rebbe spoke about his Rebbe, so Chassidim speak that way about our Rebbe. Now, it doesn't mean that what happened was a figment of our imagination. There was a funeral, and there was a burial, and people go to the ohel, but it's not the same idea of death as it is with a regular person. There's still a continuation of life and a continuation of presence amongst us in this world and so on. What that could mean practically, So maybe tomorrow in our Mashiach class, we'll continue a little bit on this subject. Okay, and by then, tomorrow, maybe we'll have some more questions, and that'll help. Okay.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Yeah, prince, the same word for prince. Rabbi Yehuda was called Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, Rabbi Yehuda the prince. But it meant he was the leader of Israel. So in the days that they had no kings, the highest position of authority was Nasi. Danny, I ask you a question in a second.